First of all, how I got in was I had left here and went to Cleveland. I was in my 11th year in West Tech in Cleveland when Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Well, I was in the 11th grade, and I wasn't going to be 18 until the next month. What I did was got pretty mad. I went down, joined the Navy, and I told them I couldn't go until sometime late in January after I got out of 11th grade because I had enough credits to graduate. And so they didn't take me till March. So I was in the Navy from March until 1948, 6 years. When I got into the Navy, the reason I wanted to go into the Navy, I'd always planned on that anyway, because I couldn't go to college. It was during the Depression and nobody had any money for college. And so I thought I could get the training in electronics that I wanted from the Navy, which I did. And I went to Chicago University, and I'd already knew a lot about International Morse code, so that part was easy. And I had specialized 3 years in electricity in high school, so I had a pretty good background knowledge and got through real easy. Well, they sent me, I was supposed to go to destroyer. I got to Philadelphia Navy Yard, and they said they needed me at Lakehurst Naval Air Station, which was fine with me. I always wanted to fly. And I got there and was a radio operator for about 2 or 3 months. And, well, one of the strange things I remember happened, I could copy code a lot faster than some of the others, so I got some of the easier jobs in the Radio Shack. And one of them was I had 2 receivers on each side of me and 1 in front of me. The 2 on the side were in Morse code, and I had to keep 3 typewriters and 3 logs on the 3. The one in the middle was a command frequency. In fact, I remember the frequency. It was 3,000 kilocycles. And all I had to do was log what they said on that. It was a voice one. But they had a command frequency, and they wanted to keep several logs along the East Coast in order to have a pretty good record of what went on. And I was sitting there one night, and at that time, if you remember, the Coast Guard became part of the Navy. They would go out on shore and get their cruisers up and down the lake looking for U-boats or spotting different things. Because when I got to Lakehurst, I used to see merchant ships blow up at night from the U-boats just off the coast because they had free reign in 1942. And anyway, this radio operator called from Coast Guard ship and said, "We'd like to return to port." So the other operator says, "Well, why?" He says, "We'd just like to return to port." And the commander that was there got on the thing, said, "Well, did you complete your mission?" Negative. "Well, then complete your mission before you can return to port." About an hour later, they called again. The same thing happened. And he says, complete your mission before you return. Well, when about a half an hour passed, same operator come on and says, "We'd like to return to port." Well, by this time, the commander was really teed off. And he come on there and he says, "Have you completed your mission?" Says, no, we have not. He says, then you got to complete your mission. But why do you have to return to port? And the operator said rather sheepishly, our captain is seasick. But anyway, I got transferred then to the transmitter building to take care of that. I was in charge of taking care of the transmitters. We had them all remote control. We were out in the boondocks. And I wanted to fly, so I got up in the airships every chance I got. And I would fill in as a radio operator. And of course, it took me a long time to convince the communication officer to let me get transferred. I even went to Lighter and Air School, but he did that for selfish reasons because he wanted to keep me at the transmitter building and figured if I was an aviation radio man, then I wouldn't have to worry about, or he wouldn't have to worry about me getting transferred to a ship. So that's what happened on that. And anyway, I did finally get transferred down to Georgia, my first squadron down there, and started to fly. And at that, just before that happened, we had another incident out there. You know, the Goodyear blimp that flies around here, we had what was called an L ship. That was about the same size as the Goodyear blimps, about 100 to 125,000 cubic feet. And just a small ship, we used it for training. We flew in the Atlantic mostly in K-ships, which is 450,000. We carried a crew of 10. And we all got to fly the blimps all day long because the pilots would sack out while we flew around convoys. And, but anyway, in California, they had the L ships, because we didn't have many in 42 at the time. The L ships were smaller, they used them for training, but the Japanese worried them about the Japanese U-boats. So they used L ships there. They figured they were big enough. They carried a few bombs. And usually they had a crew of 3, 2 pilots and a mechanic. Well, one day they said they spotted an oil slick. They sent the L8 out. And there were a couple of ships that says they were flying perfectly normal and everything like that. And so about an hour later, they never heard anything from them. The ship drifted back into town, or into, I think it's Dali, California, and crashed into some wires, and nobody aboard. So they had all kinds of stories about figuring that they were investigating this, and one of the pilots went back and looked out the hatch and fell out or something. The other tried to rescue him. And there are all kinds of theories, but a lot of us had a different theory, because Ralph back there, being a Marine aircraft mechanic, will remember the Franklin engines. You probably remember that, Frank. Yeah. The Franklin engines had one problem. If you didn't lean them out, they would load up with carbon and you couldn't start them again. And that day they took off without the mechanic, so there was just 2 of them in the plane. And we think what happened is that the engine stopped while the one was back looking out of there. We used to leave the door open in hot weather because that left it kind of cool. You put a chain across, but it was easy to fall out. And he probably fell out. Well, the other pilot went back to see him, and they might have got a bounced or something, and out he went too. And Nobody ever found the bodies or anything like that, but at that time, the airship would have been lighter than air. With the engines off, it floated up and eventually floated back because of the westerly winds into California. And they put it back together and it was flying again, but nobody ever found the pilots or know for sure exactly what happened. I went to Brazil from that point on and flew down there. Of course, before I left Georgia, I did do one thing that we were sending blimps over to fly in the Caribbean, or in the Mediterranean, because we had a lot of U-boat activity over there, and we were flying looking for them. Well, the problem is all the activity was at night around there, and they wanted to fly low so they could see the silhouettes of U-boats in the moonlight or whatever they could see. And so they developed a radio altimeter. And I was putting them in Georgia and calibrating them. And I don't know whether I would want to fly over there. They flew without any lights. And we had 3 lights, just like street lights, green, red, and amber. And we would calibrate them so they could fly about 5 foot off of the water at night. No lights, couldn't see anything. And if you got the yellow light, why, they'd go up a little bit, and then the green light. So I had to calibrate those pretty accurately. But anyway, after that, why, just became routine, and Japan and Germany had surrendered by that time, and I finished my duty in Brazil, and they sent me back to Lakehurst, and I was in the electronic shop over there. And the thing is, we were all career men at the time. I had planned on staying in. And all of the other technicians there were, all had families around there. They all had families with them. Well, the division officer came in and says, they're looking for somebody to study the first guided missile of the Navy, the BAT. So I says, I'll go because they don't want to move all them up. So I went to Washington, D.C. and studied the airframe and also the radar that they had on that. And then they sent me to MIT and was there for a couple of months. And I became a bombardier for the first guided missile. But this was a glorified B-24. It was PB-4Y2, which had a single tail, bigger engines. And this was the first time that one of those were ever dropped, and I was a bombardier on that first one. And you could see it leaving the wing on that. You might look at it later if you want. And so I finished my career there, but if you want to know any more questions on blimps or anything like that, I'm willing to answer them.
How far did those blimps go?
Well, the longest I flew was 22 hours. And we had 2 or 3 meals sometimes, and take off in the morning, have breakfast, and usually have lunch in there. And you had enough crew that you kept changing off, and had 4 bunks you could lay down and take a little nap on that.
Did you go far during those 22 hours?
Yeah, just flying around looking for U-boats or flying around convoys. The thing that we all were kind of proud of, we never got credit for sinking any U-boats, although now we have. 10th Fleet with all battleship admirals. They had no ships. They were all battleship admirals. All sightings and shootings of U-boats or sinking of U-boats. There were 1,200 that Hitler had made, and there are 800 of them in the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So there was a lot of them that were sunk. And we had only one of them that shot down one of the blimps. And all of them were in the water for about 6 hours before a destroyer picked them up. But only one fella died in that, and he was from Philadelphia, a fellow by the name of Isidore Stevens. He couldn't swim. And how he got in the Navy, got by his basic training, nobody knows, but he couldn't swim, and he drowned. But the rest of them were all picked up. But they were, well, they did have one other one that, this is rather interesting. Destroyer came across one of the U-boats in the morning after they were up recharging their batteries and captured the U-boat. They brought them in off the coast. I don't know whether it was coast of Florida or the Carolinas, but anyway, they brought them in, and you know how newspaper reporters were. They were right after the captain and everything like that, trying to talk to him, and one of them finally cornered him and says, he spoke pretty good English, and cornered him and says, look, you fear the destroyers and the cruisers out here more than anything? And the pilot, or the captain, shook his head. He says, no, the baby dirigibles. Yeah, yeah, because we could spot them in the water if they came up to periscope depth, drop a depth charge on them. It was, we'd fly 700-800 miles out to sea around convoys and looking for the U-boats. We were busy, but the nice thing is that we figured we saved more lives than we took, because flying around the convoys, the U-boats would not attack them. And we got to the point where we were flying 24 hours around. By that time, we had about 136 K ships. And in Brazil, they had the M ships, M ships, yeah. It was bigger, it was 650,000 cubic feet. Now, the reason for that is that I never told you about blimps fly a lot different than an airplane. And where you have a submarine, anybody that's a submarine here, well, I see one there. When you get down, you either blow the ballast enough, and anyway, you reach a depth of, say, 100 feet, and you're cruising at 100 feet. You're actually, if the engine shut down, you'll stay at that depth. You can't do that in a blimp, because we would take off in the morning, would be somewhere around 3,000 to 4,000 pounds heavy. So you're flying like this in the morning. As you burn fuel and become lighter, at night you're coming in, you got your nose down in order to get in. And the height of a ship is totally different. You have air ballonets in the ship in order to keep it up. Because when you're on the ground, the pressure, a high pressure, will make the thing limp. In fact, we always say that was the way the blimps got named. Was the English made the blimps or designed the blimp that we use in 1915, and used them for hunting U-boats even back then. And the first one they built didn't have the air ballonets. So when they were on the ground, the nose sagged and the thing sagged. So he called this first one an A-limp. Well, then when they put the ballonets in and you keep it up, he called that a B-limp. So it became a blimp. Now, there are a lot of people that don't agree with that, but it still makes a good story. Oh, yes, yeah, because if they got to keel depth, which is about 60 feet, I think, or periscope depth, I think the keel would be about 60 feet. We flew over them, you could see them. You could see the whole outline of the ship. Believe it or not, it was 10 men in there was not crowded, because there'd be 3 up in the front where the controls were, and sometimes the 4th one would be up in above that with a machine gun. And we originally had a 30 caliber, and then they eventually changed it to a 50 caliber. We carried 1 depth charge, 500 pounder, because you couldn't carry any more, and just not enough room because of the fuel you had to carry. But we had a lot of room, really. And you'd bump into people now and then when you were going from one place to the other, but generally speaking, it was pretty good.
But you mentioned food, meals, so like you had like packed lunches and stuff?
No, we had a cook fly with us. Yeah. We had it really nice when you really come down to it. We didn't starve by any means. We had good food. Never got seasick or airsick. But anyway, flying them's, like I say, a lot different. In fact, I'm a pilot myself, or was for a long time. And flying an airplane is easy. You take off, you climb up to the altitude, you adjust your trim and everything, and you sit back and relax and fly. You can't do that in a blimp because you're constantly changing weight. And when you do that, you've got to put air in the ballonets when you go up. You got to make sure you don't get above pressure height. And because if you get to pressure height, which will be 3 inches on a manometer, and no air in the ballonets, and you couldn't go any higher because the valve on top would start expelling helium, and you'd go down. So it was more difficult to fly one of those. We would fly on a general rule about 500 feet. Yeah, because you didn't want to get up to pressure height and start worrying about losing helium. Some of them carried bombs. We had some K-ships that had the racks with, it'd drop a whole cascade of bombs, 100-pound bombs. It'd have about 20 of them, and they'd drop them all at one time, yeah. Because we didn't want them to know we were up there. Oh yeah, we could if we knew their frequencies, yeah. Yeah, but they'd have to be surface. Back in those days, they'd had to have an antenna up in order for... Well, American subs where we flew had to be on the surface. So if anyone was submerged, we knew it was a U-boat. Yeah, if you were flying, or if the sub was out along the Atlantic over there, they were on the surface. And we'd contact them to make sure it was one of ours. Well, like I say, if they're submerged, we had to assume that it was a U-boat. We carried 2 100-pound or 100-gallon slip tanks below our feet. So that if we lost an engine on takeoff, we're heavy. The first thing you drop is that'd be 1,200 pounds. I mean, yeah, 1,200 pounds. And that would be a big thing to drop. The rest of them were up overhead. And we would transfer fuel after we'd been out about 15, 20 hours. We'd transfer fuel from them back up into the main tanks.
Did you ever get into any traumatic situations?
No, the only one that was quite a history was the Shenandoah, which went down in 1926, and that down here in Ada. And Lieutenant Commander Lansdowne was a pilot on that one, and he was his last flight. He did not want to go. He tried to convince the Navy that the weather was too bad, and they got into a gale and tore the ship apart. In fact, my admiral was one of the survivors of that. He was a cadet, and he was sent back there to check the tail. He and some other cadets. So 15 of them floated down in the tail section and survived. We would cruise about 65 miles an hour. And if we're around convoys, we'd be flying about the same speed that, not much more than what the convoy was doing, because we'd circle around them all the time. And so we had to slow down, and we saved a lot of fuel that way. That's why you could stay out for 20 hours or so. That we had two oh yeah, had two Pratt & Whitney engines. I think there were 750 horse. See, you could go across the country probably in 22 hours.
You mentioned Brazil a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
And was this so that control the activity down in that part of the Atlantic?
Willie, we had U-boats all the way down there. In fact, before the war, or at the very start of the war, before Vargas, who was the head of Brazil at the time, they were a neutral country. So the sailors from U.S. would be in a bar. There'd be German U-boats sailors in there too. The next day we'd go out and be looking for them. But then Vargas, he wasn't a very good prime minister down there, so he was afraid that they were going to dump him, so he says that he declared war on Germany and said he'd have an election after Germany surrendered, or after the war was over. And I felt so sorry for those Brazilians. They were about as big a match as a high school football team would be against the Cleveland Browns. Yeah, I mean, they were absolutely no match for the Germans. I was on a ship when I went to Brazil the first time. There were so many of us we couldn't fly down, and we went on a ship down to Recife, and we had a bunch of wounded Brazilians on there, and they were the most pathetic looking bunch you ever saw in their life. They were all little guys to start with, and of course that made them a harder target, but at the same time they could not fight the Germans, no way. And then when Germany surrendered, Vargas got worried. He declared war on Japan. I happened to be down there when both of them surrendered. I went to college, went to Akron U, and worked for RCA as a field engineer for a while, and then went into business for myself. I hope I wasn't too boring.
Not at all.
Oh, thank you.